In part one, we discussed the fact that the holy sacrifice of the Mass will fail completely for a time. The churches shall lament with a great lamentation, for there shall be offered no more oblation, nor incense, nor worship acceptable to God. St. Hippolytus. It's those last words, worship acceptable to God. Okay, let's return to 1969, the Decree Missali Romanum of Antipope Paul VI, Paul I of the Conciliar Church. Okay, we've already discussed how the vernacular retranslated from for many to for all. Okay, thus invalidating the Novus Ordo in many parts of the world. On that basis alone. There are many other arguments, the Ottaviani intervention, etc., but we're going to just go with that and take that point. Now, you still had places that had valid rites. The Eastern rites were not at that time changed and may still remain unchanged to this day. And so they're valid. We'll return to that in a minute. But let's go over, let's just say we had only the Latin Rite and the Novus Ordo was introduced. You have the Orthodox. They've been separated from the Catholic Church for almost a whole millennium now. 1054 is the date you'll see listed of the separation. There have been some segments have rejoined, become uniate again, and some have come in and gone out. Okay. Their rites remain substantially unchanged from the early centuries, much as the Roman Rite remains substantially unchanged from the early centuries, according to at least one source. In any case, their masses are valid. We have always been forbidden to assist at the masses of the Orthodox, even if no Catholic Mass is available. Why? It's very simple. They are not in full communion with the Church. Let us return to St. Hippolytus. Worship acceptable to God. Their masses are not acceptable to Almighty God because they are in schism. True. For the majority, including even priests and sometimes even bishops, it's only material schism. But it is still schism. They are not in full communion with the Catholic Church. Thus, Catholics are not permitted to worship in Orthodox churches. It has been that way for almost a millennium. True. Vatican II, part of at least 5%, if not more, opened the door for communicatio and sacris. That's the same term used in 1917 Code of Canon Law to describe a crime. We've discussed that one separately, communicatio and sacris, in a separate video. You probably want to review that one. In any case, they want communication and sacred things with non-Catholics. All right? When you are in schism, even only material schism, you are technically a non-Catholic. Will you be held accountable by Almighty God? That's not for us to judge. Canon law is quite clear. We are judged solely by what we see externally. And we have to make certain presumptions for the good of the church. We're not judging the soul at this point. When we see an external sign of schism, we're presuming schism exists. And we will advise Catholics, do not go to a schismatic for Mass. Okay, now we'll step forward to just a couple of centuries ago. A couple of major break-offs. The first one in Utrecht, the second one after the only Vatican Council, the group that refused infallibility. But they're known basically as the, quote, Old Catholic Church. They run under hundreds of names now, but that's just a generic term, Old Catholic Church, and that typically means the Utrecht succession of orders. uh, until the 1960s, 1970s, with a possible very few exceptions, there's no question of the validity of those orders. But they're schismatics, and those who rejected infallibility are heretics. And thus Catholics were forbidden to go to the, quote, old Catholic Church. Always have been. For the same reason. It's not a worship acceptable to God. And there are other breaks out there. They have valid masses to this day. Now, in the old Catholics, some of them adopted the new rites of the Vatican II Church, the Conciliar Church, of course. There goes validity out the door with the new rites. So you'd have to be careful. But those that have preserved the rites of the faith, unchanged, have valid sacraments. There is no question about that. Yet we're forbidden to go. Okay. One of the early migrations after the institution of the Novus Ordo Missae was go east, young man, instead of the old saying go west, young man. In other words, go to the eastern rites that have not changed. It would depend on which part of the United States you're in, whether this trip was possible. Where I grew up in Oklahoma City, there was no eastern rite. Within hundreds, maybe 500, 600, don't know. In any case, where there's an Eastern Rite Church, they, okay, we go east. They still have valid masses, valid sacraments. The presumption became among people who eventually formed the traditionalist movement is that if it is valid, it is good. Now, we've already seen two cases, the Orthodox and the Old Catholics, certainly valid sacraments, okay, especially amongst the Orthodox, but we've always been forbidden to receive them. So the church requires something more than simple validity. Okay, so you go to the east. Now there's a problem with going to the east. Now priests might be fine, but they are technically in schism, following an anti-pope, Paul VI, John Paul I, John Paul II, etc. Further, their bishops are notorious heretics for their participation in Vatican II. Someday we should probably go over and demonstrate that all of the bishops defected at Vatican II. There's a different story. In any case, they are technically in schism. We must only go to masses in communion with the true Pope. So I will not advise you to go to any mass that is not celebrated in union with me as the true Pope. That is the only consistent position. Okay, we'll get off that for a while, and let's go over to the traditionalists. Independent priests, they were handed this Novus Ordo, some of them even before this, when the new All English Canon came out with "for all" in there, thus invalidating it. And that, something isn't right. Articles were written. Some priests refused from day one. With one possible exception, they're probably all dead now, that I know of. But I mean, they're a dying breed. They refused from day one. I will not accept this invalid mass or this doubtful mass. Then they would discover the Ottaviani intervention. They would discover Patrick Henry Omler's piece, the new All English Canon, and they realized, no, we can't accept it. So they pulled away and returned to the Latin Mass, or didn't leave it in the first place. They might have accepted some of the interims going from Latin to vernacular. But when a substantial change came out, I'm out the door. Are their masses worship acceptable to God? And that is the key point. That's why we discussed it in our video on Communicatio and Sacris. And so I think we're going to go for a third part on this one, because we have a lot of ground to cover. But we've already demonstrated that there are valid sacraments which Catholics are not permitted to receive. And therefore they are not worship acceptable to God. Okay, this exists. And that's the key point. And so God bless you. Until the next video.